You're just anti-women. Maybe that accusation seems absurd, since a majority of my audience is women. Or maybe you've heard the accusation before and it's very familiar to you. Whether you've been on the receiving end of those words or you've seen others in your community or social media be accused of such, it is a very real accusation. Being pro-life apparently makes me anti-woman. I think this sort of scared Ben away from being actively and vocally pro-life because it's a woman's world, a woman's body, a woman's choice. Women who are pro-life received this accusation, that they're bowing to the patriarchy and are inherently anti-woman because they are intruding on other women's wombs. Being pro-marriage apparently makes me anti-woman. I think women should get married and have babies. Does this happen for everyone? No, but I think we are called to it. And that marriage then has to come before my career and my travel plans. And those babies then become my calling, and my identity changes, and my character changes, and my priorities change. And that's good. That's all good. Does that make me anti-woman? If you think being pro-marriage and pro-motherhood makes me anti-woman, then I fear you have not seen a well-functioning marriage or a strong mother. Think back to our first episode. How much that role forces us, in a good way, to be feminine. Pro-marriage and pro-motherhood should automatically mean pro-woman, not the other way around. Pro-masculinity makes me anti-woman. If I want my husband to be a strong leader, physically, mentally, and spiritually, and I want my son to get dirty and get strong and be a bold risk taker, then I must be anti-woman. See, feminism has poisoned our society into thinking that the worldly definition of femininity is the pinnacle, the achievement, the goal. It's seeking to demasculinize our society, to sterilize our boys, physically, mentally, and spiritually, to elevate women as the example and proof of greatness, and also to somehow create freedom. But you can see so many ways that this movement went too far. The trans movement is directly linked to feminism, and now somehow being anti-trans, or even just against trans women who are biological males in women's sports, makes me anti-woman. Because I want women to play against women, to have equal and fair competition, which seems like the most feminist idea it was originally, has now become anti-woman and anti-feminism. Because the feminism movement has gone, well, it's gone more than one step too far. From the start, it's pushed the limits of society and broken norms and rejected biblical truths. Welcome to Canadian Rubies. We're a podcast for Christian women talking about life, politics, and culture here in Canada. We've covered topics from hospitality to literacy to Bill C-9. Today is essentially our second history lesson. In episode 2, we did a deep dive into the history of abortion laws in Canada, and today we're looking at the history of feminism and how it has brought us to where we are today. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you find our podcast. I say this so confidently now. I am anti-feminism. I could not have said that 10 years ago. I was finishing up college and so confused by this movement. I knew I wasn't anti-women. How absurd would that be for me, a woman? I knew I was pro-life. That part wasn't confusing to me because I understood that being pro-life was being pro-women. But I was also pursuing a career and interested in women's rights and appreciated my right to vote in the government and was confused about whether I should vote in the church. I knew aspects of the feminist movement were wrong, but I was not opposed to women in the workforce, obviously, as I was one, as were most of my close family members. And overall, I thought feminism was good. I was pro-scripture, pro-life, and pro-woman, including pro-feminism. And I could justify it too. I was pro-feminism because I was pro-first wave feminism, and I could get behind some later things, but I was anti-third wave feminism, but I was still pro-feminism. Now I know that I am pro-life, pro-woman, and anti-feminism, because feminism today is all of the things. I cannot pick one thing out of the feminist movement and say that I am pro-feminist. I can pick something out and say, this aligns with scripture, and so aligns with my worldview. But I'm not behind the movement. And I think if more of society was clear on what the movement was and is, then we could be more clear on the fact that we can be pro-woman and anti-feminism. Let's get into the history of feminism here in Canada. It covers about 100 years, so we're not getting into all the details, but we'll hit some highlights and see where it's at today. Then you can conclude at the end what you think of the whole shebang and whether you are anti-woman. Most of this history is sourced from the Canadian Encyclopedia. So, let's roll the clock back to 1867. Okay, so nothing major happened in 1867 in the women's movements, except that the Dominion of Canada was created. But the first wave of feminism is generally agreed to have taken place around 1867 till 1960. Because with Canada establishing themselves as independent, this sort of opened the door to women getting more into the workforce especially, but also just figuring out how they fit into society of this newly established country. As they established themselves in these ways, they were able to build up groups that sort of gave them more power, like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The 2 world wars helped to ramp up this call for equality in the workforce, as well as the right to vote for women in Canada and the US. You might know this picture that is often identified as Rosie the Riveter. It wasn't widely known at the time it came out in 1943, but later it resurfaced and has been used as the picture of first wave feminism. You know, she's the proof that women are strong, capable workers who can get outside of their homes and build things and actually contribute to society and even contribute to war. I mean, prior to this, war was a man's world, and, except for rare cases, the only real involvement for women was in hospitals. And often these were hospitals at home, not the ones on the front lines, because it was dangerous there, and women weren't meant to risk their lives in the same capacity as men. Something that feminists, of course, find to be extremely sexist. These wars also brought an increased push for the suffrage movement, giving women the right to vote. Yes, this was being pushed by select independent thinkers for many years by this point, but it was mostly considered radical, until wartime hit, and men were dead or missing, and suddenly there could be entire towns or municipalities with very little representation. This played into it, being the right moment in history for women to receive the right to vote. Over the course of 24 years, women across Canada received the right to vote. Interestingly, the first 3 provinces to make this change were Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, all in 1916. Quebec was the last one and didn't allow it until 1940. Generally, provinces allowed women to run for office as soon as they allowed women the right to vote. Federally, Canada sort of eased into the women's right to vote, first allowing women who were in active military service for Canada or Great Britain or an ally to vote, and then 8 months later, in 1918, all women who met the same qualifications that were required for a man were given the right to vote. Ironically, there was a little bit of confusion, and I imagine mild panic amongst some of the leaders of this feminist suffrage movement when voting became legal, because they weren't sure who they should vote for. Some even suggested women-only parties, while others suggested that they should try to add their voices to the male-dominated parties of the time. Besides the right to vote, the first wave of feminism, as it's called today, did bring other small wins. The Women's Labor Bureau made some headway on women's employment and the realities of women more consistently in the workforce, such as equal pay and maternity leave. There was also work done to end violence against women and children, which I'm sure is something we would all support. Overall, first wave feminism did do some good things. Opening up more opportunities for women in the workforce is not a bad thing in and of itself, especially for women who need to support themselves or for families who are struggling to get by. Giving women the right to vote is not a bad thing in and of itself, and I certainly encourage women to make their voices heard and use that right for good. But it is interesting to note that in the last few years of elections in the United States, data has shown that unmarried women are far more likely to vote Democrat and in favor of more progressive ideas than married women. Married women become more grounded into a way of thinking that is more likely to restrict government overreach and focus on major economic issues rather than obscure social ones. Unfortunately, statistics from 2021 also showed that only 15% of 18 to 29-year-old women were married, which is half of what it was in the year 2000. It's also true that married men are more likely to vote conservative than unmarried men, but unmarried men are more likely than unmarried women. Maybe family is a good thing. Maybe having something, or rather someone else, to live for makes one more concerned about preserving society, maintaining a capitalist economy, and conserving real human rights, like the right to life. I do think in some ways, because women are so different than men, that politics has become more emotionally charged and socially driven than in the past, and I am not convinced that it is a good thing. This has opened the door to the government being involved in so many different things, such as abortion, homosexuality, death, transgenderism, and other progressive ideologies that are being successfully pushed into government legislation, and it all stems back to the feminist movements. It's also important to note that first wave feminism wasn't called feminism. Most of the women who belonged to this movement would just call themselves suffragettes. They weren't looking for total equality or abortion rights. They wanted a voice in government and the opportunity to be legally represented. Yes, there were radicals, but they did not represent the vast majority of the suffragettes. Today, they are called feminists because they were fighting for women's rights, but many of them were satisfied when they received the right to vote. That brings us to what is known as second wave feminism, which covers approximately 1960 to 1985. Some of this was simply a continuation of the first wave, such as equal opportunities in education and employment, as well as work to end violence against women. However, other things begin to be added, one of the most notable ones being birth control. Second wave feminism also came around at the time of the hippie movement, which turned out to be a dangerous combination. This countercultural movement rejected capitalism, promoted drug and sexual experimentation, and was generally against any expected societal norms, particularly when it came to workforce expectations. Does that sound familiar at all? Although not all hippies would call themselves feminist, most were countercultural in all things, including gender norms and expectations. This isn't even referring to whether women should be in the workforce or receive equal pay, but more that they're against the ideas that motherhood and pregnancy is a beautiful feminine thing, or that women should seek to be kind, compassionate, and caring in their homes and societies. Men can express their femininity and women can express their masculinity, and it's just all the same. Love is love, man. That's not a quote from the hippie movement, but you can totally see the connection and how it all ties together. This is where we start to see true blue feminism. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan came out in 1963. Where she fought against the primarily domestic roles of women, arguing that they could not be fulfilled and happy in the home because they could not grow. The main culprit identified by feminists was the education system, from elementary through college level, and they sought to reform the curriculum and the teaching force. Starting with the teachers and curriculum requirements to create public social change. Is there another movement that's been doing that? Feminism was also about creating separate spaces for women to show they were just as good or better than men, and to give opportunities to support women, such as women's bookstores, women's publishers, and venues dedicated for female artists. There was also a fight for more opportunities for women in sports, which included part of the curriculum changes in athletics. With a focus on women in sports, in education, and in the workforce came a focus on birth control. The strong, successful, athletic businesswoman that the feminist movement was pitching could not afford to be slowed down or forced back into the home by a pregnancy. At the time, both birth control and abortion were illegal, but the activists disregarded the law until it could be changed. Birth control was removed from the criminal code in 1969. Then, of course, you may remember from the episode on abortion history that a doctor began providing abortions illegally in 1967, and by 1988, the abortion law was removed from the criminal code because, according to the Supreme Court, it violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As the feminist movement expanded, it became less cohesive. Those moving goalposts don't always move in the direction that everyone expects them to. For example, many feminists were against pornography, much like the first wave was against alcohol, because it was seen to increase violence against women and children. However, others saw pornography as an opportunity for freedom of expression and a way to promote the free spirit make-love movement that aligned with hippie culture. In addition, some believed that any attempt to prevent the spread of pornography was a form of homophobia. So, it's at the end of the second wave that we begin to see the focus of the feminist movement shift from women's rights to non-white heterosexual males' rights. Again, some positive things were achieved during this time period, such as more voices speaking out against violence against women, and work done to curb and illegalize much of that violence, especially among the First Nations. But that work does not require the radical feminist ideologies that emerged during this time period. At the end of the second wave, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale is published. I haven't read it, and I actually probably should, so I understand the cultural obsession with it. But it certainly focuses on the importance of reproductive rights and how one can become complicit in the face of government control and overreach. Second wave feminism also began to focus more on the voices of lesbians and promoting the cause of homosexuality, as well as starting movements against racism. Honestly, when I say feminism affects everything, it really, truly does. If you wonder why so many social justice warriors seem to be 50 to 60-year-old white women, it's because this was the culture of victimhood and implied prejudice that they grew up in and were indoctrinated into. To conclude the second wave, they are just a few years out from abortion being legalized. Birth control is legalized and readily available in so many various dangerous forms that they keep adding to today. Women have the right to vote across the country, and the curriculum is being changed to encourage women not to find fulfillment in the homes, but rather as athletic, emotionless, masculine businesswomen. That brings us to the third wave of feminism from 1985 to present day. Some split this into third and fourth waves. I think here the feminist movement really starts stumbling over itself. The problem with playing the victim card is that there is always someone else who is more of a victim than you. And suddenly, it's not just about perceived gender inequality, but also classism, racism, ableism, and prejudice regarding sexual orientation. Feminism just got a lot busier. This reminds me of the recent NDP convention. If you haven't seen the footage of the equity cards at the convention, it's pretty ridiculous, and you should look it up. Apparently, it did start out as equity cards just for women so that they could move ahead of men in line as lesser heard voices. But then it blew out of control when people were multiply victimized and held several cards to show all of the ways they were prejudiced against and deserved to have their voice heard more than anyone else in the room. Now, in all of this, I'm not saying that there are not inequalities, or were not in 1985. But if you only focus on what you can't do instead of what you can, then no one will ever be happy. It just breeds a culture of discontentment, which is not a culture that believers should be taking part in. Remember the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Feminism today also advocates for environmentalism somehow. The only explanation I can think of is that it is so closely connected to the hippie movement, which was all about going back to the earth. Or maybe because it's called Mother Earth, it became a feminist cause? It's just another prejudice some of us hold, I suppose. Feminism also sought to promote lesbian women, and so it helped the gay communities. While no feminist group is necessarily credited with the win, it is the kind of radical redefining that feminism does that ultimately led to the legalization of homosexual marriage in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, gay sex had only been decriminalized 35 years earlier in 1969 under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. That was at the height of the feminist hippie coalition. I briefly reviewed the history of LGBTQ rights in Canada, and let me tell you, it is horrifying and disgusting, but also it's barely history. It's all so recent that it just makes it all the more absurd that this is suddenly treated by society as something that is totally normal and acceptable. And you know what? We have the feminist movements to thank for this, for promoting an emotion-driven, politically correct society who votes and argues based on their feelings rather than their morals. They ripped apart the family, which is the core base unit of a functioning society, and they continue to chase after rights that will allow more babies and others to be killed, so that they are not the victims who need to be loving or compassionate or caring, because that requires work and sacrifice. But in a society without God, what is the moral ground? Why wouldn't I play the victim and reap the benefits? Why wouldn't I flash any equity card to get to the front of the line? Feminism and the hippie movement created the me culture. My feelings, my time, my opinions, my identity, my body, my choice. Nothing else matters. We must fight to be the opposite of them, time and time again. God gives me time. God provides wisdom in His Word. God gave me a unique personality, and He made me fearfully and wonderfully. Every choice I make of my own free will must be in line with His will. I am not my own. There is no me to focus on. Love God and love the neighbor. The Canadian Encyclopedia's concluding sentence on their article on early women's movements in Canada, 1867 to 1960, is this: activists' long and often unfinished struggles for a better deal in education, law, employment, and healthcare confirm that inequality is ongoing. And honestly, this may be one of my greatest frustrations with the feminist movement. It's just never done. Like the suffrage. We did it. Nope. Now it's the next thing. And this is why you can't trust the movement, because the goal is never the goal, and the posts keep moving, and suddenly you don't like the location of the goalposts anymore, but it's too late to stop the train. I love a good mixed metaphor. That's where I need to wrap it up today. And I didn't even get into the trans movement and how it's built out of and supported by the feminist movement, which should be the most absurd thing, but somehow they just don't see that. So that's another history lesson done. And I just know I'm going to keep mentioning feminism in future episodes because it's done so much to shape where our society is today. Hopefully this serves as a good background to that ongoing discussion. And hopefully you can confidently say that you are not a feminist and that you also are not anti-women. Let's end with our prayer requests and suggestions. First, for yourself, pray that you may remain firm in the truth of God's word and not be tempted by the victim mentality, the me culture that surrounds us. Pray that you may be content where God has placed you and be able to worship him with gratitude from that position. For our society, pray that their eyes may be opened to the absurdity of the culture they are pushing. Pray that they may become centered on a moral compass, that they may hear the word and may no longer be tossed to and fro by the currents of the day. For Canadian Rubies, pray that we may continue to grow and reach more people and so spread the message of the beauty of a world that is focused on God rather than on self. I'll end with these verses of encouragement for women from 1 Peter 3, verses 3 through 6. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening.